The Juno World Affairs Council presents Turkey, Caught in the Middle East, with Sinan Ciddi. Ciddi is the director of the Institute of Turkish Studies at Georgetown University. He's researched, analyzed, and taught Turkish politics.
I think I'm good. Okay. Well, good evening, everybody, and thank you very much for inviting me and hosting me, particularly to Jim Clark and the World Affairs Council of Juno. It is a great pleasure to be here, as it is to be speaking under any roof of the World Affairs Council affiliates across the country, and this is speaking engagements that I appreciate and treasure the most, simply because there's always a captivating audience as opposed to a bunch of students in a classroom who can't wait to get out. If that should be the case and you feel totally phased, please welcome to leave at any time. But I do appreciate your time and your hospitality for welcoming me to one of my bucket item lists places in the world to actually visit. And it is an absolute fascinating pleasure to be here and being able to see this wonderful state, and even if it is for a very brief period. Unfortunately, the topic that I'll be speaking on is not so rosy, given heightened international concern over what is happening in my part of the world, or my original part of the world, and what I continue to teach about, both students and policymakers back on the East Coast. And with that, I should just essentially launch into it and say that in a post-Arab Spring environment, it is, I don't think policymakers, analysts could have gotten it so wrong or so or unpredictable as it has become, to the extent that the prevalence of both the Syrian civil war and the proliferation of the radical extremist ideology and activities as presented by the Islamic State, or hereforth referred to as IS, presents no less than what I would refer as the greatest security challenge and threat to not only regional peace and security, but also collective peace and global security. But at present, it is no exaggeration to say that the direct and immediate territorial integrity of at least two sovereign states in the Middle East is under direct threat, and the continued viability of the state of Syria and the state of Iraq is tenuous at best. And this is not due to just the violent and extremist activities of the Islamic State, or IS, but also the virtual collapse of the Iraqi federal state itself, and also the possible collapse and implosion of the Syrian Republic, which is headed by Bashar al-Assad, and the Islamic State is only one of the factors that is contributing to the possible territorial integrity of these two states. But it also represents greater problems insofar as massive population displacements that we have not seen or encountered since the end of World War II, which is presenting a great strain and challenge to the institutions of the European Union, which is not designed to handle or accommodate the vast flows of migrants across its borderlands and what to do with this. But also challenges in terms of security and terrorism, as we have seen bombs go off in places such as Paris, Istanbul, several times in each case. In the case of in Turkey, it's 4 times. In the case of Paris, it's been 2. Even in the United States, we had our first IS attack in the form of the San Bernardino attacks. And all of these challenges, as they keep on multiplying, I think it's clear to see that if we watch TV enough and listen to more credible news sources, what we are seeing is a very frightening scene where there seems to be a clear lack of policy, not only by the administration in this country, but also globally, not least of all by international organizations such as the United Nations, the international community as represented by the European Union, but also by regional powers which seem to be ever increasingly pursuing their own individual interests, and also pitting great powers against one another, especially the United States and Russia once again, in an environment whereby the Russian Federation seems fit to ever increasingly flex its post-Cold War muscle, and this is presenting an extremely unstable picture for the immediate future. What follows from this, from my perspective, is what you might refer to as a very regional, country-specific analysis. And instead of having me here, next week you could have a person who'll put it across the Russian perspective, and next week from that you could have the Iranian perspective, and the Saudi and Qatari and the Gulf perspective. And what this says to you is that regional perspectives and country-specific perspectives on the fundamental quagmire that the Middle East is ever increasingly heading or hurtling down towards is the name of the game. I think the fight against the Islamic State is at best a distant second for most countries' priorities right now. If we watch the news here from the CBS, CNN newsrooms, it is all against what are we going to do against IS, what is everyone else going to do against the prevalence and spread of IS, what are we going to do to contain it, what are we going to do to reverse it. But from the perspective of regional actors such as Turkey, the Gulf states, Iran, the Syrian regime itself, Turkey, which is what I'll be speaking about, the Islamic State is an important challenge to overcome, but it by no means looks like the primary thing which everybody's trying to resolve. And that in itself, in terms of regional perspectives and rivalries and interests, is helping to shroud the bigger peace and collective security challenge that is presenting this world. So it's not a rosy picture, I'm afraid, that I have, and if you'll bear with me over the course of the next several minutes, we might be able to sort of lay out what these are, and hopefully entertain some of your questions. So if we look at this whole sort of quagmire of the Syrian civil war, the challenges presented by the Islamic State, where is Turkey in this? Why is it relevant? What kind of problems does it present to the international community? What kind of problems does it present to containing the spread of IS? What challenges does it present to the United States in trying to achieve its goals in the region? I think it's very relevant and very, very alarming. Traditional Turkish foreign policy up until about the early 2000s, when Recep Tayyip Erdogan took over the reins of power, popularly elected and subsequently re-elected numerous times, Turkey's foreign policy in the entire Middle East, for those of you not familiar with Turkey's sort of approach to the Middle East, is one that was very distant from this part of the world. Even though Turkey is on the doorstep of the Middle East, Turkey's foreign policy approach to the Middle East was non-involvement, non-interventionism. We barely had diplomatic relations or representation in these parts, in neighboring countries. Trade relations, economic ties, security arrangements were very, very loose. Turkey liked to remain very distant from the Middle East as much as it could. Instead, all of its eggs were essentially in one basket, that is the focus on the Western Hemisphere, pursuing the goals of being admitted into the European Union. But as it stood, Turkey felt very distant from the Middle East, mainly because following the end of World War I, Turkey decided that its ambitions and aims was to be a highly regarded member of the Club of Western Nations as put forward by its founding leader, Mustafa Kemal. Even on controversial issues where Turks do feel passionately about, such as the Israeli-Palestinian question, the Turkish state not once in its entire history has condemned either Israel or come out very strongly in support of the Palestinians. It has always maintained a distant relationship, which is independent of public opinion, obviously. Where this changed is under the Tayyip Erdogan premiership and now the presidency, where Turkey decided that in order for Turkey to have its place in the sun, to really become what Erdogan's government in the last 15 years outlined as coming to age of being a top 10 economy, Turkey really needed to branch out, really expand beyond the boundaries of its limited foreign policy goals. Turkey right now is the 17th largest economy in the world, and Erdogan did set its sights on becoming the top 10, but that's looking increasingly less and less likely. So a reorientation on the part of Erdogan and his governments over the last 12, 13 years has seen a new opening for Turkish foreign policy whereby the Middle East became a primary goal. And it made a lot of economic sense. Why place all your eggs in one basket and limit yourself to trade and economic gains by just concentrating, or in that case, in a statistical case, of 66% of your economic foreign trade with the European Union, when there are infinite number of more possibilities opening up in your immediate doorstep. Turkish producers, exporters, Turkey's burgeoning and expanding economy, growing at approximately 7.6% per annum over the last decade, was looking for new markets to open up into, and the Middle East and North Africa, even sub-Saharan Africa, seemed to fit the bill. So we saw a radical change and shift in gear with Erdogan and his governments not necessarily abandoning, but certainly de-emphasizing its commitment and advancement towards a somewhat or lessened unwelcoming EU, and a more sort of pronounced opening towards the Middle East, where credentials of complete democratization, liberal democratic norms and conditions aren't a prerequisite to have access to economic markets and trade, but also a Eurasian focus in terms of really expanding Turkey's ties with Southeast Asia, as well as the Russian Federation. And this really paid off for Erdogan and his governments. In Turkey, what you saw was probably a quintupling of its GDP between 2002 to 2012, up from about $350 billion GDP to about $1.4 trillion as of 2011. It's a vast expansion. And you can see sort of signature sort of openings of this and reflections of this even in the US. The vast expansion of Turkish Airlines as the national flag carrier, up from about 35 planes to now just over 300, expected to expand up to 600 planes in the next 5 years, really carrying the flag and expanding Turkey's economic and trade interests to all parts of the globe. And Turkey, up until about 2010, very much succeeded in this. It was projected and put out there as the model country. And in return, we saw a boost in trade, economic ties, and growth of influence in the Middle East specifically. Erdogan started mediating in critical and protracted and long-term conflicts in the Middle East, not least of all between Israel and Syria at one point. And even at another point, Turkey was spearheading talks between the Israelis and the Palestinians along with its international partners. Turkey also helped to very much generate a possible deal between the P5+1 and the Iranian nuclear deal back in 2010, because it was seen as a country which could talk not only to Iran, but also to its NATO allies, of which it is a member since 1952, but also its strategic partner, the United States, which has had a long-standing relationship with since the end of World War II. So Erdogan's opening up into this part of the world really started paying off. And where this starts getting really murky and where this starts getting very dark is with the onset of the Arab revolutions, or the so-called Arab Spring. And to Turkey and Erdogan's credit, and where that credit very much dries up on my end, is basically highlighting the essential point that it wasn't only Turkey that got it wrong with Syria. Syria, I think, is an interesting country example that depicts the failure of the Arab Spring revolutions, mainly because nobody predicted and foresaw that the Assad regime would be so resilient, would be able to attract so much external support and influence by the Iranians and the Russians, and also the survivability of the regime in the longer term. And to Turkey's credit, Turkey honestly assumed that, like everyone else, the Assad regime would crumble in less than 12 months with the amount of international pressure to bear upon it. And this was very much contra to what Erdogan and his government had invested in this country. Like Egypt, like Libya, like Tunisia, the Turkish government, business interests, economic interests, had spread considerably in the pre-revolution years. Turkey and Syria have not had traditional strong ties. Strong is not even the word I would use to describe it. Turkey and Syria almost went to war in 1998, 1999, for reasons of basically the Syrian regime harboring Turkey's number one enemy, the head of the Kurdish separatist organization in Turkey, the PKK. But Erdogan in the early 2000s turned a new leaf. By the late 2000s, what you saw was a very rosy and close relationship between the Assad regime and Turkey's Erdogan, because Syria was a main highway to get Turkish exports out into the immediate Islamic Middle East map through its highways. So Turkish truckers, essentially what you saw, and European truckers also, traveled through Turkey right out into the Middle East through Syria. And towns, border towns like Gaziantep in Turkey, which is a major town, grew even faster with the border trade. Entire shopping malls were constructed simply to accommodate Syrian middle classes coming across the border to buy goods and services for themselves. But unfortunately, when the Syrian civil war began, Turkey was placed in a very difficult position. Where do we stand on this? Do we stand with our NATO partners and allies, as well as the Syrian public, which wants to see a regime gone, or do we side with the Assad regime because we've spent so much time basically putting together a peace, not a peace plan, but building a good relationship with, particularly with a country which we've had no relationship with in the past 80 years, but also because it is the key to Middle East trade for Turkey. And the answer came very, very quickly. Erdogan implored with his Western partners and said, give me one more chance to negotiate with Assad. We have a good working relationship. I think he will listen to me. I think he will work with the international community to transition Syria out of dictatorial rule and put an end to the fighting. When Assad said no, or actually said yes, and then decided to keep fighting against the rebels, this is when Erdogan really flew off the rails. Turkey's entire opposition to Assad, henceforth, and even up until now, is very much based on Erdogan's personal disappointment and anger with Assad for crossing him. And that, in my line of business, in international relations and policy making, is not the best way or the best reasons or motivations for constructing foreign policy. I'm sure many of you have heard the saying that in foreign policy, there are no eternal friends or enemies, there are only eternal interests. Erdogan does not subscribe to this view. Turkey's entire opposition and vitriolic opposition to Assad is based on the fact that Assad did not do Erdogan's bidding and basically cost him international credit vis-a-vis his allies. And to that end, and since then, since about 2012, Turkey has been primarily engaged in something that it is not engaged in since its entire history as a republic in 1923, which is regime change. Overthrow of the Assad regime, come what may. So how does this mindset, how do these motivations basically highlight the complexity in building a more stable and credible Middle East? And remember, this is just a Turkish perspective. Well, first of all, it helps us understand it in the global climate in which all this is taking place. This is a school of international relations theory that I don't subscribe to, but nevertheless, in this case, it helps us understand why we're in such a dangerous situation. The end of the Cold War and the international climate since the end of the Cold War is what we refer to as a multipolar global climate. There are no two hegemons, the United States and the USSR. There is an absence of a bipolar world order. And the absence of a bipolar world order does allow or has allowed for increased regional conflicts in which international organizations such as the United Nations, such as the only remaining superpower, the United States, is not able to contain sectarian rivalries, is not able to put down intrastate conflicts like civil wars in Syria, or even if you go back to cases such as Rwanda. But the main argument being that under a Cold War situation, the kind of quagmire, civil war, where there are multiple actors such as Turkey, Iran, Russia, the United States, the Gulf states, having very rivaled interests, would not have occurred or be allowed to play out. And this is why it's very, very worrying. And Turkey's particularistic interest in terms of wanting to topple the Assad regime because it crossed Erdogan's red lines is something which is infinitely more possible in a post-Cold War environment. In wishing to topple Assad, Turkey has gone to great lengths under the Erdogan regime to really step out of line in terms of collaborating with its partners, in stepping out of line, in working within the boundaries of international legal norms. For one thing, Turkey has supported and aided any and all opposition groups, including very nefarious and dangerous groups, as we know, such as Jabhat al-Nusra, which is the local al-Qaeda affiliate in Syria, which is interested in toppling Assad. Turkey turned a blind eye to the activities of the Islamic State for the last 2 years before Turkey was directly bombed by them, because the Islamic State was also interested in toppling Assad. But Turkey is also interested now in a post-Assad regime where it is in a position or demands a position which is unsustainable and undeliverable from everybody else's perspective. Turkey, simply put, has a lot of asks. It wants a Middle East or a Syria, post-Assad Syria, where in its northern part, no Kurdish entity or no autonomous Kurdish entity will come to existence. The very elements, the only elements right now in Syria, which is helping to combat the Islamic State, the PYD and the YPG, the only groups that the United States is directly supporting is one which Turkey does not care for. In fact, in the last 2 weeks, Erdogan said to the US government, saying, you have two choices, you're at a crossroads. You can either help your traditional ally, or you can help terrorists, the Kurds, who are helping to carry out bombs in Turkey. You've got to make a choice, you can't have both. So Turkey is demanding of the United States not to help out the only elements which are interested in taking out the Islamic State, because it has a desire not to see a strengthened Kurdish entity in northern Syria. Turkey would also like a post-Assad situation in Syria, a regime which is Sunni and broadly aligned and friendly to Turkey. That's great, but that's not something that the Iranians want. And the Iranians would also like a post-Assad regime in Syria, possibly if it has to be post-Assad, one which maintains a Shiite dominant rule in Syria, because that is what the Iranians would like to do. And Turkey finally would also like a post-Assad Syria where there is no Russian interest, i.e. no Russian military presence in terms of air bases or troops or influence, or what it calls a lack of sectarian influence by Iran in the future government formation of Syria. Therefore, what you're seeing is, where is Turkey's ambition in this in terms of combating the greatest threat that we identify in this country to collective peace and security, that is the Islamic State? And the answer is not very high. Turkey seems to be exclusively focused on trying to go after these particularistic aims that it is seeking to achieve. No strengthened Kurdish entity in northern Syria, the absence of Russian and Iranian influence, and then, and only then, is Turkey willing to step up and take the fight against the Islamic State. And to that end, what has it done? It has really gone out of its way to try and sort of push these parameters through. If you remember, in November, Turkey shot down a Russian jet fighter over what it claimed to be its own airspace, and it probably quite likely was. But the fact that Turkey shot down a jet fighter has now got the United States and all of its NATO partners very, very worried, to the extent that what will Turkey do to ensure that a Kurdish state is not allowed to take up in the northern territory of Syria? Will it commit ground troops, as the president of Turkey has alluded to? And if so, will it confront Russian forces which are stationed in northern Syria? And that presents a very, very dangerous picture. Turkey in the last 3 weeks has hinted at taking preemptive action and unilateral action in bombing Kurdish targets. And to this day, it still carries this out by shelling Kurdish targets, which are partnered and supplied by the United States in fighting against the Islamic State. If Turkish troops do pour into northern Syria on the pretense of taking out Kurdish terrorist elements, as they call them, this will likely require Turkish air support for such ventures. If that does happen, will the Russians put up with Turkish fighters flying over northern Syria? I would suspect not. All of this says to you that there is a very volatile, very unpredictable scenarios playing out on a daily and more fluid basis, which are now evenly matched by continuous inaction on part of the United States. We do know that the United States is not interested, for a variety of reasons, for inaction in Syria or anywhere else in the world for that matter. And there are credible reasons for this. And the most credible ones of those are obviously bitter lessons learned from warring in Afghanistan and Iraq, both of which do not seem to have paid off. And in terms of the bill, it's come to about $8 trillion of debt that we've piled onto our national debt. Public opinion, even following San Bernardino attacks in America, does not necessarily understand what it is or why it is that we should be sending ground troops or becoming more directly involved in Syria itself. That being seen by countries such as Turkey and Russia has resulted in the following. The Russians have seen it fit under the Putin regime in the last 5 months to very much call out America's inaction and very much flex its muscle to prove to the world that it is again a great power. And it seems to stand now that we might have to reconcile ourselves to the fact that the Russians will be allowed to expand into Ukraine and basically annex large swaths of the Ukraine, if not more. Basically to prove to the world that that the Russians can flex that muscle. The Russians have also proven, due to US and NATO inaction, that they can and will and have placed troops and air support permanently in Syria. And they don't have to remove that. That is great power play. That is US inaction in Syria and the Ukraine has also resulted in Turkey taking part in actually provocative attacks against Russian fighter jets, threatening to put troops and compel possibly NATO and the United States into a conflict which it does not get into, because we are not taking the lead in this most significant threat to global peace and security that we have faced since the World War II. And as a result of this inaction on our part here, which I admit does not necessarily come easily, it's not a decision reached comfortably. I think the administration, as it stands now, or the future administration in 12 months' time, will not have easy answers to this. And there is no easy answers, and I'm not positioning the country to do X, Y, or Z, because I think we should. But it is useful to bear in mind that continued inaction will lead to several certainties. It will continue to pit Iran against Sunni regimes in the Middle East, the Gulf states and Turkey right now, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Turkey against Iran, because Iran will also continue to project power or its interests into Syria. It will also continue to pit Iran and Russia against Turkey. And possible hot conflict between Russia and Turkey today is more realistic and probable than it ever has been in the last 80 to 90 years. Turkey's divergent policies, contrary to US and NATO interests, in shooting down fighter jets and provoking conflict with the Russians and shelling Kurdish targets in northern Syria, has strained the US-Turkey partnership to such a level that Turks have now even decided to call out that they are considering the closure of air bases currently open to US personnel that help logistically support operations against IS in Syria. Furthermore, Continued inaction on the part of the US will likely see a rise in continued extremist and ideological prominence in Syria, Libya, and in probably large swaths of North Africa. It is the nature of inaction and the nature of interventionism that we currently prescribe that's the problem. And that is basically saving the day. What we are doing currently is very much a containment policy which is based on bombing our way out of an impending threat, which is the Islamic State. We are carrying out bombing sorties against certain targets, but we are only basically taking the edge off the symptoms of a much larger flu. We are not tackling the underlying causes of ideological extremism that has been given breathing room in a post-Arab Spring Syria and post-invasion Iraq. And whilst those are very necessary, I think the longer-term goals of confronting the roots of ideological extremism should be tackled also. Things like funding infrastructure projects such as schools, so that 6-year-olds don't pick up Kalashnikovs in Syria and shoot people, or be told that our main enemy is the West and it's okay to shoot Americans or Western people because that's what the Quran tells them to do, should be where we are targeting our investments, not necessarily just smart bombs or drones, which are infinitely necessary to combat the now, but in the longer term, without direct and actual involvement in the ground, not only will our generation have to continuously confront this, but 4 generations down the road will also continue having to confront this, simply because the generations of youth that the Islamic State is raising now are already investing 4 generations down the road. It's not about being a global policeman, but the direct interests, whether it's national security, whether it's regional peace and security, America's global economic and national interests, these will come under continued and direct threat, I think, in the next few years and continuously, if we don't take more decisive and protracted and long-term look at how to contain the roots of these problems before it's too late. So I'll stop there. Thank you for your time, and I'll entertain any and all questions that you might have. Thank you. Oh, and please use the mic, because otherwise the cameras won't hear it, apparently.
I'm wondering if you could comment a bit about Turkish domestic politics as they apply to both ISIS, Syria, the refugee crisis, PKK, and what seems to have been a tendency over the last 4 or 5 years, particularly with Erdogan's presidial ambitions vis-a-vis your parliamentary democracy.
Thank you. That's a very complicated picture to put together from my perspective. I'll put it in this way. I think Recep Tayyip Erdogan as president of Turkey is bad news. He's bad news for Turkey. He's bad news for Turkey's international partners. He's bad news for NATO. He's bad news for our strategic partner and ally, the United States, that we've had a very long and committed relationship with. And Washington is at a point where they are done with him in substance, but it's the essential sort of neighbor you can't kick off the street, because Turkey is right now needed from a variety of perspectives. It's needed for logistical support for the conflicts against the Islamic State. It's needed for continued and coordinated efforts against migratory flows. It's necessary against what we're going to do, if anything, against what's happening in the Ukraine in the future, or if the Iraqi Republic, the Federal Republic, breaks up. Turkey is an indispensable country in that part of the world which the US has to deal with on that level. Domestically, Erdogan is using this knowledge, this certain knowledge that the international community will not put too much pressure on him. When I say international community, I'm talking about the EU and the US, because they need him too much. And he's using that as a means by which to stomp out any and all political opposition. And he's been doing this very effectively since 2013, since the rise of the Gezi protests. And as a result, basically used that specific aspect of the international community of needing him to basically go on the rampage extrajudicially to try and change Turkey's regime from that of being a parliamentary democracy to a presidential autocracy, whereby he will have uncontrolled and unrivaled power, possibly analogous to what Putin has in Russia, so that he can basically establish his own agenda, not only domestically, but internationally. This has resulted in basically what I would call institutional capture in Turkey, whereby the separation of powers has been curtailed. The rule of law has been abrogated completely, just about. The courts are a joke. All forms of political dissent are quickly and increasingly dealt with in a very abrasive and draconian manner. Academic opinion is silenced. Journalists have been imprisoned to a very high level. It's not a very rosy picture for Turkey, but Erdogan has a lot of reins in his hand, and he's using this in the absence of international pressure to go even further. Yes, sir.
What can you say about the future of ISIS? We speak of containment, but I don't know what that means.
Yeah.
You know, ISIS is a sustaining phenomenon, and it's not going away. They're able to recruit. They have a core theology or whatever it is, and I presume that they don't really have time horizons. They're going to keep at what they're keeping at indefinitely. You know, we hear about establishing a caliphate and so forth. It's very difficult to see how that's going to play out. There's nothing we can do to explain to them why they're wrong and turn them into what we think are good citizens and so forth. So where does that leave us?
It's a very good question, and it's a very difficult one. And because, like you correctly say, this is not something that's going to go away in 2 years or 5 years or even possibly 10 years. I have a particular view on this, and it's not necessarily the most popular one. There is a price that we have to pay for primacy. We are the biggest power in the world. Our interests are ubiquitous, much in the same way that the British Empire's interests were ubiquitous and all globe encapsulating. We have certain ideals and standards that we champion, and that's a starting point from where my views come from. So, but more immediate reasons to act more decisively come from probably more immediate goals. And I would suggest that right now, a military solution in terms of, sending 200,000 troops into the area is not going to solve all our problems once and for all. It's not. It might help eradicate and disarray the Islamic State's infrastructure and command and control, and we might even get rid of a lot of them. But it's not going to help contain and stem the tide of the spread of extremist ideology, which has come to proliferate and spread out across vast swaths of poor North Africa and the Middle East, which is a hotbed of recruitment for the dispossessed, the losers of globalization, underinvestment, and great power play. I do think that in the longer term, the United States has to basically step up to the plate in collaboration with partners that it builds, its regional allies, the international community such as the United Nations. I think it is incumbent upon the United States to take the lead because it can take the lead. As we see time and time again, nobody else will take the lead. And the reason for doing that is because if we don't, it directly impacts our national interests, our economic interests, our security interests. And what I mean by action is some of the things that I alluded to in the talk. It will take further investment that a lot of analysts and policymakers who aren't in the political establishment, because they never are, they're not legal, they're not electorally accountable, to take decisions and divert resources to parts of the world which will help overcome and stem the tide of extremism, which is investment in primary education, investment in primary resources and infrastructure projects. Because if we don't, all we are seen as a country is we are seen to be the supporter of Israel. We are seen to be the supporter of big money interests, global oil interests, and that we're only doing what we are interested in for ourselves, and which basically, if you look at it, radicalizes public opinion against the United States and serves as a primary recruitment ground for extremists. And at that point, we do what we've always done, which is bomb. And in the entire history of warfare since World War II, there is not one single campaign that we have come out victorious as a result of that. A good example was with the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. Senator Charlie Wilson said afterwards, if we could just stay behind and spend $1 million on water projects, putting up a couple of schools, showing that we are interested in this part of the world, even if you look at it from selfish reasons, education will help stem the tide of extremism. And this is something within our power and infinitely less costly than an $8 trillion war that we financed on somebody else's credit card. In the last 10 years, I think we've gotten a lot further. But this is my view. It's not everybody's view. It's not necessarily the most popular. But the longer we keep on sort of trying to play whack-a-mole and just try to stem the tide of extremism on the military front when it is imminently endangering our border security, is not going to get us very far. Extremism of ideology can only be, in my opinion, countered by extremism of education, of real ground investment. We have great institutions in this country which do that. We have the Peace Corps, we have the Fulbright program, we have USAID, which all come under, unfortunately, the legislative scrutiny in terms of congressional budgets, and we don't necessarily think it's worth funding. We can up fundings on those. This is a choice. We can work collaboratively with our international partners to basically invest in these parts of the world which are serving as hotbed recruitment grounds and centers for basically Islamic State today, Al-Qaeda yesterday, who knows what in the future, that will continue to challenge our very bedrock beliefs. But if those aren't enough, they will certainly challenge and curtail our security interests, our trade interests, our economic interests, the more we stay away from that.
The Kurds as an ethnic group have about 30 to 40 million people, the largest ethnic group in the world without a nation. Could Turkey come to terms with a free Kurdistan in northern Iraq?
It's a very good question. Yes, the Kurds are the largest stateless nation in the Middle East, some say the world. And it's an interesting question simply because I think it was and possibly still is within Turkey's power and realm to come to terms with some sort of Kurdish entity that will come to be developed and into existence in the region. Why do I say that? The Turks are very much comfortable and have very good diplomatic ties, security ties, even economic ties with the Kurdish regional government in northern Iraq. That is the only trade route that we have right now into the Middle East. Possibly over 80% of consumer goods in northern Iraq in the Kurdish regional government are Turkey supplied. Turkey has a consulate in Erbil, which if Iraq breaks up, will become the embassy of Turkey. Turkey's had a prime ministerial visit to the Kurdistan regional government, which in its entire history never happened. The Chief of General Staff, Turkey's highest military officer, visited his counterpart in the KRG, all since 2007. We get on and accept the validity of the KRG in northern Iraq because they don't pose a threat to Turkey's national security, and in effect, they project that further. The reason why we're not, or the Turks are not comfortable with the existence of a Kurdish entity in northern Syria is because the YPG, or its political father, the PYG, is a local offshoot of the separatist entity, the PKK in Turkey, which has been basically locked in an armed struggle against Turkey for the last 30, 40 years. And Turkey fears that if it's given breathing room along Turkey's southern border and a new Kurdish entity comes into operation or into existence, that will continue to protract and further Turkey's national security interests, and terrorist attacks will continuously happen in within Turkey's borders. But that does not mean that Turkey is right in this. I would suggest that up until June last year, Turkey had a credible peace process and plan with its own Kurds, roughly analogous and comparable to what the British government attempted and succeeded in with the Irish Republican Party, the Irish Republican Army and Sinn Féin, and that model was very closely looked at and studied, and deliberations took place. Erdogan summarily withdrew his support from the peace process when he realized in the run-up to the second elections last year that we had, that there were a lot more votes to be had by Turks in vilifying the Kurds, sort of nationalist fervor. And once he basically curtailed that peace process, the PKK, the separatist element amongst the Kurds in Turkey, started its armed struggle and campaign against Turkish targets, which has resulted in hundreds of casualties and deaths of Turkish security personnel, soldiers. And this has started a very violent conflict again within Turkey. I think it is within Turkey's grasp and the political administration's grasp not to have started this again. There was a way, a credible peace process. Erdogan did not have to withdraw his support from it. It was a political choice for him. And that in itself tells you to what extent an nefarious person he is, willing to sacrifice a very long-lasting political conflict in favor of his own political position. And it's possible, but I think we need a new leadership structure in Turkey.
You said, Erdogan is bad news for Turkey, which I totally agree, and we, last few sane Turkish people all know how he wins, by getting rid of the solid wall that Mustafa Kemal built between mosque and state, and kind of ruining the education system, which wasn't already perfect, and making people believe, to me, believe more, know less, believe more, and but how can we cause him not to get elected again? Because that's how he gets elected. But what can we do?
Does this remind all of you in the audience of the upcoming elections in this country? That's a great question. I mean, I think Turkey's institutions, domestic political institutions, as you say, as you correctly point out, Turkey's Kemalist institutions, which were in themselves were not perfect. They by no means represented a pluralist conception of democracy in Turkey, and had a lot of failings to a certain extent, I think, and were outmoded. And to a certain extent, Erdogan has given a lot of credit in the early years of his administration between 2002 to 2008, 7 maybe, really went out of his way to basically make Turkey a more pluralist democracy. That's what the pundits told us at the time. And, Turkey's progress towards the European Union became much more pronounced. There was a certain seeming environment in which pluralism thrived in the early years of the Erdogan regime. That is no longer apparent, as we know. And Erdogan really has tightened his grip over all institutions in Turkey. That has been furthered by very strong economic output, which has resulted in popularity at the polls for people to support him. So this wasn't arbitrarily done. It wasn't he just subsumed power without any base of support, which makes it even more powerful for him. And he has gotten to these positions by popular elections. It's not you know, tin pot cronyism. He's been elected to this position very strongly. So how is he contained? And why is that important for any of us here? We contain him by, you know, all the factors that put him into office: strong economy, strong public support from broad swaths of the electorate, have eroded to a great extent. And the only key thing keeping him in power in a very strong position is the security apparatus of the country. It's not to be underestimated, but it's not everything. The economy is in a very perilous situation right now, on the brink of disaster, and it has been since about 2010. But international credit agencies, the banks, the slowdown in GDP growth are very apparent. That is likely to cost him in the polls if we have an election again. I don't know, you know, what his plans are. But I don't know, course of nature, he could just pass away. Who knows? I mean, he's 62, he works 24 hours a day. What do I know? I don't know. All the best minds, pundits, analysts in Turkey have said that we are in uncharted territory as far as Turkish politics goes. We don't know. And why does this matter for any of us here? Erdogan is one of the few but emerging trend of strongmen, elected strongmen in the world for countries which are in very critical parts of the world and are in a position to cause or protract or prolong mayhem. Putin is one of them. Erdogan is another. And the list goes on and on. Who knows, we might get one in this country soon. So I don't know. I mean, it's, you know, we're on uncharted territory. That's the best answer I have for you, I'm afraid.
Yeah, I was wondering if you could comment a little bit on Turkey's role, either helping or hurting or creating problems or what have you, with respect to the migration of people out of especially Syria and Iraq as a result of the unrest in both places.
Thank you. I think this might be the last question I can take. We've got 3 minutes, 40 seconds. I have to stop when this thing goes red. I think this is one of the few areas where Turkey has been instrumental and useful to a great extent. We could go on and on for the real reasons as to why Turkey initially accepted to take refugees and the amount it did. Basic answer is Turkey never knew it was going to have to take 3 million people. I don't think any refugee-receiving country knows that it's going to get that much. It's very hard. But you know, at some level, there is some recognition that Turkey looked at this and said, well, what are they going to do? I mean, if you're fleeing for your life, you're fleeing for your life. And shame on the European Union. Shame on all European Union countries. Absolutely. For looking at this primarily from the lens of, well, who's going to take are they going to take all our jobs? You know, especially and specifically given what they experienced as countries during World War II and their aftermath. And for not recognizing in the capacity that Turkey and Jordan and other countries have done, with even more limited means than we have, in recognizing a massive human tragedy in the making and really not stepping up to the plate. You know, I was listening to the news the other day, Canada saying we're taking 25,000, you know, putting up this as this wonderful 25,000 people. Canada? Germany has basically stepped up to the plate, maybe, you know, 500,000. That's quite a, but nobody else is doing anything else. A few thousand here, 5,000 there. Turkey, I think, is spending way beyond its national means to do this. They are housed in very good conditions, and the ones that can decide to keep on staying in refugee camps. They seem to be labeled as model refugee camps, really well put together. There's a lot of migratory flows. Most of them don't decide to stay in refugee camps. There are Syrian refugees all across Turkey. And what I would say about that now is it's no longer a refugee problem for us. It's a migration problem. It's a minority problem. You know, every street corner, every traffic intersection, there are Syrian children like this big, you know, cleaning car windshields and begging all over the place. And I don't know, you know, most of them are trying to get to Europe. And all Europe is talking about is how to abrogate the Schengen Agreement, how to contain flows, and what's even worse is what can we do to pay Turkey to keep them in Turkey. It's very surprising to hear this. shocking, I would say, to hear this. I mean, it's nobody's stepping up to the plate. And I understand European economies have their own strains and problems, but it's staggering to me the lack of involvement and the lack of engagement in a massive humanitarian crisis. And I'm not even talking about having to house them within European countries, which would be nice. But I'm even just talking about contributing monetarily. Not even that. They've talked about passing on €3 billion to Turkey for the next 3 years, I believe it is. It's an interim agreement, but it's woefully shy. Turkey does see this as a major problem. It doesn't have answers to what will happen subsequent to now, and when and if and when the Syrian conflict is over. Most of them won't want to go back in the immediate future, but possibly they might have to come to terms with that. But Turkey doesn't have a long-term strategy. It's just interested in maintaining the here and now, because it is a humanitarian tragedy. Thank you.
That was Sinan Ciddi in this Juno World Affairs Council presentation, produced in collaboration with 360 North. It was recorded February 24th, 2016 at 360 in Juneau, with support from Alaska Power and Telephone, Alaska Electric Light and Power Company, Coeur Alaska Incorporated, GCI, Hecla Greens Creek Mining Company, Haight and Associates, the Prospector Hotel, Sea Alaska, and Wastman and Associates Incorporated.